There will be a number of voices this evening. One will be mine, another will be the people who wrote the articles, and another will be our Father. And I will tell you when those voices are provided. He stared unflinching into the camera lens, his posture rigid as he stood at the front row with his football teammates. 80 years ago, when that black and white photo was taken, the then 18-year-old Ruby W. Brown may have been unaware that all eyes were on him as the first Muskegon Heights African-American student athlete took his place among his white peers. The date is October 2008, looking back to 1928. He was a pioneer in many ways, said Zeke Ohan, a U.S. history teacher at Muskegon Heights High School. One of the things we want to share is what a gem we have in our own backyard. He is Muskegon Heights Jackie Robinson. That's not just hyperbole. Although racism and discrimination in the Midwest was usually not as overt as it was in the South back in the 1920s, it was still deeply rooted in most U.S. communities, said Ohan. This is a photograph of Dad, larger than the one that you saw before. Our father is right there. This photo was, from 1928. It was a dangerous time for biracial people. Brown's father was part black and Native American, and his mother was primarily German. Their father spoke much about the race, didn't speak much about the racism and discrimination he faced growing up, said Alberta, Brother Harry. He loved his coach, Okie Johnson, said Alberta. His principal, Mr. Booker, was very helpful to him. You're going to hear about that. When he was a youngster, Brown would earn extra cash racking balls at a local pool hall after school. He also found part-time work at a bowling alley and a jewelry store, money he used to purchase his own school clothes. Quote, "My dad was a pioneer and a hard worker." This is interesting. I'm reading a quote for myself, but that's what it is, said Harry Brown, a longtime instructor at MCC. He worked in the foundry for 15 to 20 cents an hour and saved enough money during the Depression to purchase the family's house in 1935 for $500. And any of you who know about the Depression, putting $500 in the bank wasn't easy, and he did everything to make that happen. Another article that moves us closer to where we want to be. Heights' first black grad to be honored Saturday. Ruby Wydell Brown stuck out in high school. Before the other kids got to know him, he was stared at. He was different, an oddity to them, he said. But he learned the value of education, a lesson he taught to others during his long life. This year, Brown's alma mater honored him for the efforts in helping others understand the benefits of school. While he was still a student on the outside, he got involved in football in the Glee Club. Soon he said, "There were more students that liked me than those that didn't." By his junior year, his family's money troubles prompted him to think about quitting school. One of 11 children, Brown couldn't afford to buy his school books or a suit to wear to graduation the next year. Money was scarce as hen's teeth back then, said Brown. If you said you'd pay for a sack of potatoes next week, that was it. It was a time when a handshake was as good as signing a contract. One of his fondest memories is of Principal C.F. Bolt convincing him not to drop out and offering to lend him some money to get by. He then got a temporary job in a foundry for 2 weeks and earned the money he needed, as well as that to pay Bolt back. Brown, 87 at the time, said kids today have a golden opportunity in public education. Kids now have every advantage for education that there is, said Brown, but still, not all of them take advantage of it. And this is the original graduation list in the upper right-hand corner. Longhand, no computers, very few typewriters at that time. And Dad is on that list as a college prep student. Our father died in 2000, and his death was marked on the front page of the Muskegon Chronicle. Here's part of it. Ruby Brown was able to recount those days when black movie patrons were forced to sit in the movie theater balcony. He remembered when boarding houses rented beds in shifts to accommodate the influx of black workers recently arrived from the South during World War II. An African-American businessman and nightclub owner who succeeded even in the heyday of segregation, Brown was a living repository of local history as well. His home was a collection of newspaper articles and photographs that told the story of much of the 20th century in Muskegon. Brown died Sunday in his home. He was 91. As a World War II-era housing commissioner, Brown advocated for equality and justice in Muskegon. As the owner of the fabled Sepia Club, the actual name is Sepia Cafe, but we'll accept that as well, Night Spot, he demonstrated his principles in his business. His conduct was a lesson for all who came in contact with him, including his children. I saw my dad being in charge, his daughter Alberta Brown told a reporter recently. At the club, he was everywhere, saying hello, keeping track of everything and everyone. The thing I remember and what I'm sure I learned from him is to treat people, all people, with respect. It was not always a courtesy that people returned. As the first black student to graduate from Muskegon Heights High School in 1929, Brown remembered being ridiculed by some of his fellow students. Sometimes he called me names, but I didn't say anything, he recalled in an interview this year. Brown persevered, excelling in football and participating in Glee Club and other activities. Eventually, he won his schoolmates' respect. Now, more than 70 years later, the school's enrollment is more than 95% African American. His autobiography, one of the things that Dad left behind for us, written in longhand, gives us a roadmap of where he was and what he did. And I'm going to share part of that with you. Unfortunately, glasses are necessary to get to where I want to be. So here we go. I was born in Washington, Missouri, October 17th, 1909. The 10th child of 11 children. We grew up in a large two-story house on about 5 acres of farmland. Dad farmed the land for some years and kept busy shoeing horses and repairing farm equipment for other farmers. He was very good at repairing this equipment. This is my dad's voice, our dad. It would go out during harvest season to repair the farmer's machinery. To give you an idea of where Washington, Missouri is located, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with St. Louis, and about 70 miles to the southwest of St. Louis is Washington, Missouri. And this played a significant role in Dad's early life. As the boys grew up, they left the farm and went to the cities of St. Louis, Union, Kansas City, and other towns. When the boys left the farm, my dad, we're talking, this again is our father's voice, didn't do much farming. He got a job working at the big Bush Brewery that was about 3 blocks from our house. There he would take care of the machinery at night. I want to spend just a little time talking about this because this played a role later on in Dad's life, in our lives as well. Indeed, there was a Bush Brewery in Washington, Missouri. In the 1800s, there were a significant number of immigrants from Germany that came to that area of Missouri because it was similar in ways to what they left in the homeland of Germany. The Bush brothers started a brewery in Washington. And two of the brothers married into a family in St. Louis called the Anheisers. Anheuser-Busch, you know where I'm going with this. As a boy, our father ran errands for the Bush family. This would have been, in the teens, 1914, 1915, in that particular era. But here's Dad's family pictured in the 1930s, and our father is right over here in the lower right-hand corner. So let's go ahead and get back in synchronization, and we'll see what happens. There were only about 5 or 6 colored families in all of Muskegon and Muskegon Heights when we moved here in 1922. The cities were very segregated. In the movie theaters, you had to sit up in the balcony. In the theaters that had no balcony, you would have to sit in the last 10 back rows. The YMCA didn't allow colored. You could not sit down and eat in any of the restaurants. We would go around to these restaurants and sit down at the tables or booths. We would not get waited on or served, but at least we were taking up their tables and booths. Yeah, we knew Dad was a rebel, certainly. I enrolled in Central School in Muskegon Heights, and then I went to Muskegon Heights High School. During my high school years, I played football 1926, 27, 28 as a halfback. Paul Meter was our coach in 1927. Okie Johnson coached our team in 1928, and for many years after that.
Ruby Brown gets away. A 35-yard run by Ruby Brown and 3 line plays enabled Regezi to score the 5th touchdown. Mish's place kick was safe. Ottawa Hills kicked off short to Fairfield, who made a great return of 40 yards to the Hills' 25-yard line. He got by the entire Ottawa Hills team, but was caught from behind. Brown then skirted around Ottawa Hills' right end to the 5-yard line, and after 2 tries, the speedy colored boy carried the ball across for a touchdown.
That was the first time Dad was in the newspaper, and that was 1928. I know that there's some sensitivity about what people are called, but I'm not changing anything. It's exactly the way that it appeared in those times. I was a member of the Boys Glee Club and was an amateur Golden Gloves boxer. 1928, my classmates elected me to serve on the Athletic Board of Control. This board handled all business pertaining to our school sports programs, such as problems of finance and the purchase of equipment. I graduated from Muskegon Heights High School in '29 as its first black graduate. And Dad is pictured right there. I wanted to go to college and prepare for a medical degree, but we were in a bad depression and there was no work. Jobs were hard to find and money was hard to get. The federal government installed 2 forms of work for the many men that were out of work. They formed CC camps for the young men, and later the WPA for the older men. I think they were paid about $1 a day, Dad's recollection. In order to earn money, I got a pail of water and some rags and went around the streets washing cars for 25 cents. I built up a pretty good business. I rented a place to wash cars in a garage that was owned by Leo and Clarence Champagne. I got 50 cents for washing the car and would pay 25 cents for the use of the garage. 1931, I got a job in the core room at Campbell Wine and Cannon Foundry. I started out at 37 cents per hour, and after 30 days, I got 40 cents per hour. Working 10 hours a day, I made $4, which is pretty good money for then. I worked there until the plant closed down for about a year. I got a job shining shoes at the OK Barber Shop on Western Avenue below Silverman's Hat Shop. I would shine shoes and then wash cars when there weren't shoes to shine. When a jewelry store called Salon's opened at the foot of Western and Jefferson, I got a job at the store. From 7 a.m. to 5:30 and sometimes 9 p.m., I cleaned the windows, cleaned jewelry, put crystals in watches, and received diamonds and shipped diamonds to their store in Lansing. I earned about $12 a week. 1934, there was a building on Clay Avenue for rent. It was a building that was the Hathaway Dodge car dealership. They moved to a new building on 3rd Street. I rented this old building for $50 a month. I had saved $30, borrowed $20, paid a month's rent, then it was open for business. I'll explain this picture in a moment. The next 2 weeks, I went to Hackley Bank Building, where most of the doctors and lawyers and other business offices were located. I got 10 cars for storage at $4 a month and 75 cents for a car wash. Within 3 months, I had 25 cars for storage and 8 mail trucks, which made for good business. This picture that you see up on the screen are the employees of the U.S. Post Office here in Muskegon in the 1930s. And Dad was doing okay because he made a deal in keeping the trucks safe, washed, and ready to go. I met my future wife, Glenetta, who was from the Brightwell family of Whitehall, Michigan. We were married February 7th, 1935, in the home I was renting at 464 Monroe Avenue by my brother Randolph, who was a pastor. We've lived in the same house for 63 years at the time that Dad wrote this in the late 80s. We were fortunate enough, in the 90s actually, to have 3 wonderful children, Thurman, Alberta, and Harry. Our mother came from another part of the country, and that is Swissvale, Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh. And that's the other part of the family that we're going to talk about in the form of a merger. Our mother's earliest memories were of moving the whole Brightwell family from Swissvale, Pennsylvania to Montague, Michigan. Some of the children posed for this nearly century-old photograph in Montague. And I think we figured this was about 1916. And if you look very carefully on the left-hand side of this photograph, you see the buggy that the teacher used to get back and forth to school. I mean, that's the way it was in Montague at that particular time. Our mother graduated in 29. And she is right there. And we'll get a little bit closer. Glenetta Brightwell. That's our mom. These are some photos of our father, our mother in the late 1930s, I think in Chicago, as Alberta indicated. But just a little idea of what things cost back in those days. So when we throw around figures of 30 cents an hour or 40 cents an hour, what does all that mean? The average income for a family of 4, $1,700. Average cost of a new home, $3,900. Of course, that could vary. Average cost of a car, $860. A gallon of gas was 10 cents. A loaf of bread was 9. A pound of sugar was 5 cents. A postage stamp was 3. Minimum wage, 25 cents an hour. And when George and Kurt were talking about plagiarism, if there are things that I use, I'll cite them, believe me. So here and also at the end of our discussion. This first article is about the Brightwells. If the Browns were on the pages of the papers, the Brightwells were there as well. So I'm going to read part of this to you so you know who they were and what their influence happened to be. When Thurman Brightwell came to a Montague farm in 1914 with his wife Bertie, He was 39 years old and determined to prove that hard work would bring success and security for his family. It wasn't easy being the only black family in the area, but he did not let that deter his drive to succeed. Brightwell began as a string butcher, traveling by foot to the various farms. He did his job so well that eventually, with the help of a butcher friend, he bought his own poultry livestock. As his success grew, he started buying livestock on a speculative basis to sell to local packing houses. The business proved successful, and Brightwell, with a family of 5 girls and 4 boys, bought his first vehicle, a Model T Ford. Ward Brightwell remembers when his dad started a taxi service in 1924. Now, not only did he have a taxi service along with his hauling business, but a gas station, a meat locker plant, and a restaurant on Colby Street in Whitehall. Their mother kept everything running smoothly at home, and their sisters helped with the bookwork and wrapped meat. Joe Brightwell remembers his dad's drive to be successful. He would go down to Sylvan Beach when the 2 Goodrich steamers, Alabama or the Carolina, docked. Actually, that's the Carolina that's pictured. Joe and Ward helped their father load bags and trunks in a truck. Then they would deliver them to the many resorts and cottages around White Lake. Older brothers Edgar and Wilbur made enough money in tips at the end of the season to buy a new Model A Ford with a rumble seat. Eventually, the family moved into Whitehall and acquired extensive property in the area. In the winter, their older brothers worked at the tannery, and Joe went to school in Whitehall. He says, "We were the first ones to haul kids to school from the country. They used 2 cars to pick up the kids. In the 20s, when there was a strike at the tannery, Ward says their dad helped the workers by giving them money for food." We're talking on the Brightwell side here. That would have been our grandfather. And just very briefly, stories from our mother about this particular period in the 1920s is that the Brightwell family, the kids, the father, would go out on White Lake in the wintertime, and they'd cut ice, and they'd put it in a wagon, and they'd put it in storage and pack it with straw, and then sell it to people when the weather got warm, because everybody had an ice box. That's exactly right. So anything possible to make money through hard work, they would do. Joe Brightwell says Dad never showed off his money, but he did have a love for cars. He paid people 50 cents a day to help build his 5-car garage, where he had a car for each stall. His advice to young people today would be, you got to work hard if you want to have anything. 1950, after the war, the Brightwell family was pictured in Ebony magazine. How many of you know of Ebony or heard of Ebony magazine? A national magazine primarily for and about African Americans, and there was a multi-page spread about the Brightwell family, our mother's family, in the magazine, part of which I'm going to share with you right now. And again, this is 1950, and this is what the author said about our area. Whitehall is a quiet little Michigan resort town some 60 miles north of Grand Rapids. Aside from boating, swimming, and fishing on nearby White Lake, the town has no major industry. It is not the kind of place an outsider would choose to start a business enterprise. But if the opportunity to start a new business did exist, the town's 2,000 year-round white residents say the Brightwells would have taken advantage of it a long time ago. The Brightwells are the richest family in town, as well as the only Negro family. When the Brightwells first came to Whitehall 35 years ago, they were broke. We may have had a penny or two saved up in a piggy bank, says Tom Brightwell, the mild-mannered 75-year-old head of the family, but we couldn't find the piggy bank. Now the Brightwells own real estate valued at over $40,000, a filling station, a taxi service, $20,000 long-distance trucking, an $80,000 frozen food storage locker plant, a grocery store, and a 4-year government mail route contract, which grosses them over $50,000 for the period. 1950. And I just recently checked to take a look at what the value of that was, multiply it by 10. It's actually 9.8. 10 is probably close enough. This is what they had from nothing to, in this estimation, a lot of money, value. White people in a community like this may resent you at first, Brightwell admits, but after they see you are hardworking, just like themselves, they get used to you, forget all about color. How much have we got, he says? Well, maybe 200,000, maybe 300,000, maybe 400,000. But why should I tell? A family has to have some secrets. Our dad, Thurman Brightwell, and our older brother, Thurman, is named after our grandfather on that side, and Henry Perkins, who you're going to hear a little bit about coming up. And we'll talk about the pheasants. I'll explain that just a little bit. I should probably explain it now, actually. You're going to find out that Dad worked at Continental Motors, and one of the things that, one of his jobs, because he enjoyed it so much, is that he and his friends and brothers would go out to South Dakota hunting pheasants. He loved it, and he got paid for it by Continental Motors. Why? Because he'd go out and get the pheasants, they'd bring it back, and there were these large parties that they would have for all of the influential people that they wanted to impress, and Dad dutifully went out and took care of it. So that's what they brought back for those things. In the mid to late 30s, my friend Henry Perkins and I bought a tavern license and started a business on Pine Street. We had the second license allowed in Muskegon. 2 years later, I sold my interest in the tavern to Henry so I could spend more time at my garage. I also had a machine shop on Pine Street. Didn't work there, but the two fellows that were there stayed to work for me. I owned it for about 2 years. It was something like a blacksmith shop, shoeing horses, working on heavy farm machinery. When I closed the shop, I sold most of my equipment to Lake Welding on Ottawa Street. In 1941, the war began, and I took a job at Continental Motors while continuing to operate the garage business with the help of my brothers Elmer and Otto, who worked for me. A little explanation. Dad worked for this man on the left, Jack Reese, president of the company. And Dad was a driver and a bodyguard, armed, and took him all over the country. You'll hear from Dad here in a minute about what went on. But this is Jack Reese, and also pictured on this page, you can see the date and the source from Life magazine, 1942, is a vice president of Ford Motor Company. There's Jack Reese. And C.E. Wilson, the president of General Motors. And this guy, Henry Ford. And one of the jobs that Dad had was to drive Jack Reese to the meetings that would take place during the war between all of these guys and others. And some of it was official, and some of it was entertainment. Well, yeah. Not going to read anything into it that's not there, but they did have a good time. My job at Continental Motors was to take care of Mr. Reese, president of the company. I was his driver and bodyguard. Most all the traveling was done by car. The airplanes were all taken over by the government, the Army, and the Navy. That's my sister Alberta on the car. I traveled on the average of 5,000 miles a month. Continental had plants in Detroit, also in Milwaukee. My main travel was to Detroit and Chicago. During the war, I made trips to Washington, D.C. to deliver secret letters and messages to the War Department, messages that were too secretive to mail.
This is a story about men. Not all men, but it has been estimated by the companies that employed them that there were about 4,000 or 5,000. They were African-American men, called Negroes at the time, and they were being transported by train and bus from other parts of America to work in the foundries of Muskegon, Michigan, to support the American war effort during World War II. You see, the foundries needed workers, and Negroes were available and considered best for the job. The interviews, artifacts, and the docudrama that you are about to see are about the lives of some of those men, their families, and the families of Muskegon, Michigan during the 1940s. However, their story touches the lives of countless numbers of other African Americans, because these men were transported from many areas of the United States. Most of them came from the rural counties of Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and as far away as New Mexico. Their arrival in Muskegon, Michigan changed the face of that American city forever, and undoubtedly, their efforts aided America and its allies in winning the war. The majority of them lived in rooming houses and government-built apartment complexes. However, this housing situation was inadequate from the beginning and created problems for the men who lived there. Because of the overcrowding and the desperate need for workers, the men slept in shifts, and the beds they shared were known as hotbeds.
One of the reasons I'm presenting this is to let you know about this in a historical perspective, and also our father participated in the creation of the video that you just saw. You're going to see him in one of the interviews. That's the background of the time that African Americans were brought up north to work in the foundries, the factories that were here in Muskegon and elsewhere. But I want to take a look at this. This is during the war. A tank. Where would you think that is? Somebody said Western Avenue. It's interesting you said that, because I'll get to in a minute. What our dad did was prevent that from happening on Western Avenue. GI sitting on boxes of grenades, occupying a city. And the city that they occupied was Detroit. The Detroit race riots, June 20th, 1943. Detroit was called the arsenal of democracy. Racial tensions were very high. Plants provided jobs, but not housing. Fighting erupted on the bridge from Belle Isle in Detroit that summer. 700 injured, 25 blacks killed, 9 whites killed. 6,000 federal troops stationed in Detroit. German-controlled Vichy radio said the following about this incident. The riot revealed the internal disorganization of a country torn by social injustice, race hatreds, regional disputes, the violence of an irritated proletariat, and the gangsterism of a capitalistic police. This was a possibility in Muskegon, erupting just like it was in Detroit. Our father wrote this article which this is an original, and there's one that I cleaned up, and George, I believe it will be available as a PDF document that you can download from the website here at the Silversides. Dad wrote an article in the Muskegon Chronicle about 3 weeks later to defuse the situation in Muskegon.
At that time, Muskegon was a very bad racial place. You couldn't go to the restaurants, you couldn't go downtown, you couldn't go bowling, none of that stuff. It was all segregated. And these people coming in from the south in groves like that, the people just couldn't get used to it right away. And that's why things got like they were. People don't realize what a segregated town Muskegon was way back then. And all these people coming in, just, they couldn't take it. And that's why we had put that article in the paper to settle things down, because people were getting to a place where they didn't feel good unless they had a gun in the house. They were getting ready for the big thing.
I think you know exactly what he was talking about. It could have happened here. I want you to listen very closely. I'm not going to read the entire document, but I want you to think about several things. One of them is, this is an African-American man writing an article published in a newspaper in 1943, being critical of the powers that be, being critical of the police, being critical of the federal government. But he said exactly the way that it was. And here we go. Negro post-war housing should be planned on a community basis, similar to federal public housing. If the intolerable conditions found in Greater Muskegon today among Negro settlements are to be erased, is claimed by Ruby Brown, a member of the War Housing Committee of the Office of Civil Defense. Negro post-war planning, if organized on a community basis, would offer much that is to be desired by the in-migrant. It's a term meaning somebody that comes from one part of the country to the other, said Mr. Brown. As a homeowner with a stake in the community, the in-migrant will feel the responsibility for cooperation and take upon himself civic responsibilities. It is Mr. Brown's contention that proper representation to the community at large would lead to better understanding of racial difficulties. Colored police, colored managers, and possibly public school teachers would, as it has been proven in larger cities, lead to better understanding. This is not the 1960s. Dad wrote this in 1943 and had it published in our city. The Negro came to Muskegon and aided in its industrial growth, Mr. Brown said. Mr. Brown estimated the present Negro population of Greater Muskegon at 7,000. We need to begin discussing the housing situation here and now, he said. Muskegon housing for colored people has for years been inadequate, perhaps chiefly so because the colored people found it practically impossible to purchase a home. Owners hesitated to sell to the colored family. Loaning institutions would not make mortgages, and if a colored man wanted to buy a house, he had to take only what he could find in the most deplorable condition and rundown location. It is not the intention of the colored man to encroach upon what some people feel is their territory, but when no city planning takes place and no areas are established suitable to induce a colored man to buy, he buys whatever he can and wherever he can. If anyone who does not know what conditions these foundry workers return to, what they call a home, they need only investigate in any colored district. At 2 or 3 in the morning, you will find colored men sleeping in parking lots, on the ground, in alleys off Pine Street, sleeping in stairways, or any place out of the weather. For eating, he has 2 choices of restaurants in Muskegon and 2 in Muskegon Heights. His usual meal consists of anything that he can buy when not eating in a restaurant. The Muskegon Police Department and the Muskegon Heights Police Department are well aware of all these facts. Think about that. Calling out the police departments as a black man in 1943, in print, in the paper. We're proud of what our dad said. Federal public housing will give the colored people their first opportunity to occupy modern housing, and the permanent type housing under construction will offer more than has been offered in the history of Muskegon to colored people. Conducive to good citizenship is proper housing, and it is essential that there will be considerable falling off in absenteeism when the family units move into the new quarters. Control through community spirit will do much to make the colored war worker realize his part as a citizen in the community. Ventilation, sanitation, comfort, and safety, as well as health, should improve when the in-migrant establishes his quarters in federal public housing. Our dad's words from 1943. A couple weeks later, temporary housing came to Muskegon. Riots, murders, crime didn't happen. He stood up, told it the way that it was.
It's kind of hard to tell the whole thing about it, but they came in on buses and trains, and most of them came, the foundry went down after them in buses, that's right, trucks. And when they got to Muskegon, most of them, all they had was a package of clothes or something.
What he had on.
That's what they had on mostly. And it got to be a place where there's so many of them came in, there's got to be a situation where there's no place for them to stay. And the times got a little kind of rough there because they came in so fast that some people just naturally didn't understand the fact that they were coming in to work, invading the territory, you might say. But then after a while, they finally decided to bring some housing in for them.
This was the ending of 39, going into 40. We had been in the CC camps at that time. And when the war broke out, some went right into the service, and some of us went to Muskegon to get jobs.
The living conditions were so bad that during the summertime, a lot of them were sleeping out on the lawn. And near the courthouse, you'd go there at night, you'd see people laying around the lawn sleeping. They had no place to go. That's when we got together and checked with some of the head men, and they had the government to send in some trailers. That's the first thing they had for their living. They had a bunch of army trailers came in, but it was just for men, not women. And they lived in these trailers until they went a little further, and then they started building these houses for them. They called it a housing project. And these houses were built just temporary, you might say. They call it, and that's where they stayed during the rest of the war. And that relieved the housing condition.
I can only think, and I know for a fact, of course, that Dad had the ear of the president of Continental Motors, Jack Reese, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, driving all over the country. And Dad really liked this guy and appreciated how he stood up for our father. And I know that they discussed this. And Dad was the one to go public. And so that was quite a connection that he had. Let's move around to entertainment and the famous Sepia Cafe. And we'll talk a little more about Sepia and some video and music and things like that, but I just wanted to share just a couple of things about Sepia before we move forward. Sepia was a tavern that Dad had purchased. I'll talk to you about this right now, actually. This is Dad. I worked at Continental Motors all during the war. I went into the tavern business a year before I left Continental in '48. I made good money there, about $500 per month. So again, take that factor of 10 or 11 times. Dad was doing okay. He was doing all right, and he saved almost every penny that he made. And so he had saved $12,000. And my partner, Larry Pickett, just home from the Army, put up 6, and with a loan from Muskegon Loan of $9,000, we bought the tavern for $27,000, about $270,000 today. 6 years later, he bought out his partner for $12,000. And just briefly, what Sepia is to me, it's a tavern, and the entire family work there. Our mother, Missy, counted money at home on the dining room table. So as I was a little child, there was always cash and coins and everything else. And Alberta reminded me that our mother would teach not only us kids, but also some of the kids from the neighborhood how to count and organize money. I guess she trusted him. And there it was. And one of the fortunate things for me was Dad gave me all of the pennies from the tavern. And over the years, it was a sizable sum. And for a long time, it was like, Dad, I didn't spend anything, kept it all in the bank. So what did we do? Well, emptying ashtrays, picking up and rinsing beer bottles, washing the ashtrays, sweeping, mopping, changing tablecloths. This Dad's tavern business also gave me an opportunity. Everything is personal to some extent, of playing with electronics. And in 1948, Dad had probably the first television and tower so you could get a signal from Chicago. There weren't any stations in Grand Rapids, and there weren't any stations in Kalamazoo. But there were a couple in Chicago, like WGN and WBBM, and that was it. So he'd had to have a tower to bring him in. And there were the Friday night fights, and Dad did very well in attracting a crowd to come in and watch the fights on Friday night. So I grew up in a world where I had access to everything, and Dad taught me how to use it from a child, and I used it. Amplifiers, speakers, microphones, movie cameras, movie projectors, still cameras. Dad had all this stuff. Tape recorders, wire recorders that came before tape. A record lathe. You could make your own records at that time. You know, cutting a record, well, you actually cut them with these machines. Radios. He bought me a crystal radio kit when I was 5 years old and put it together. This was wonderful stuff. Well, some kids were reading Disney. There's nothing wrong with that and having that. I read manuals for all this stuff. It was absolutely the best. I loved it. There was a film that was done a few years ago called Up from the Bottoms. And a significant portion of that film, the Schaubs, Jim and Rod, put it together. And Sepia was featured in that film. And allow me to share that with you. Oh, by the way, when Alberta and our family, we were living in Thailand a few years ago, Alberta started to get calls from friends, and PBS had picked it up, and it was running all over the country. So we didn't even know it. So I'll share some of that with you right now.
The blues came to Muskegon in the 40s and beyond. Jazz and blues legends stopped by on their way to Idlewild, north of Muskegon. One club they made their way to was Sepia's.
B.B. King was one of the regulars through here. And Bobby Blue Bland, John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf, Lil Junior Parker, Johnny Taylor. Every name in rhythm and blues that you can think of had been to Muskegon. And either before or after, they would be at Sepia's.
You had the Sepia Tavern, down on Spring Street. Dave Sepia sold it to Mr. Reuben Brown. And that was our night spots.
Oh, did I ever go to the Sepia Club? Yes, it was where we had fun.
And it was just striking to see the people and they had the jazz on and the blues and how they danced and they laughed and they had a place that they could go to.
That was about the only nicest place that they had to go at that time, because they wasn't allowed to go in the white places. But it was a nice bar. Black and white would come there, so we'd have a good time down there.
It's a funny thing about black businesses. They usually don't disallow people to come in because of your color or anything like that. Everybody's welcome.
People just came and enjoyed the music and danced. There was a large dance floor.
The Sepia Club was the place to be.
It was the elite place of entertainment at that time.
People dressed when they came to Sepia because it was an event, it was a night out, and they came to have fun and have a good time.
It was like going to a Hollywood movie. They were dressed in hats and gloves and purses, and the men had on straw hats and ties, and they dressed up to go to Sepia.
I can remember hearing people say, wow, I have to go shopping, I have to get something new to wear to Sepia this weekend.
Sepia was a hot spot because that was where the blacks could go and drink and kind of work off their anxieties.
The weekend started on Thursday night. Because, see, that was the last shift for the third shift. They didn't go to work on Friday night.
I can't tell you very much about Sepia Club. All I know that it was downtown, and I know that if I had gone in there when I was growing up, I would have been in serious trouble.
Sepia was more actually than just a nightclub. Style shows were held there, and I remember Dad would put up a long runway. Different people would model their own clothing, sometimes clothing from other stores. And whenever a young soldier went off to war, they would have a party for him at Sepia called a victory party. And they always gave him a nice send-off and 2 cartons of Chesterfield cigarettes.
We appreciated certainly the recognition for Dad in this film that was shown all over the world, which is a great thing, but I'd like to point out just one inconsistency, and that is this man was pictured as the owner. That's our Uncle Otto. That's Dad right there, and our mother, and just wanted to set that part straight. These are 8mm movies, and Dad was quite a movie buff, and these are some of the dinners that were held at Sepia. And if you notice the way that people are dressed, many of them are suit and tie, very formal. You'll see later that some of these are candlelit. And this was still going on when I was a child in the early 1950s. Got to play a little music because Sepia was the center of music at that time for rhythm and blues and jazz. And I'll show you in a moment where I used to stay when I was a kid. My mom would put me to sleep in the back, and all these famous people were performing on the other side of the wall, but I didn't know who they were. They were just people that Dad hired to come in and play. I was about 2 or 3 years old. But at some of these things, Dad would shoot the film, and then a few weeks later, Dad would show the film, bring people back, and then have another dinner. Just wonderful stuff. And when I was, well, to be quite honest, about 2.5, Dad taught me how to run the projector. So I would thread it all up. Dad would give me the cue. I would start the film. He'd be up in front and he'd talk about it all. Yeah, that's me just a little bit. Well, one of the things also, just to, the comment was made here about sepia, is that it was a draw for anybody in town who enjoyed a good time, who enjoyed the music, and anybody was welcome, and Dad ran a very tight business. Let's listen to some of the music.
Harry, Alberta, your entire family, thank you very much.